Okay, here's a question for you. Do you ever find yourself going through musical phases? This is where maybe all you're listening to is a particular genre or a subgenre, or maybe it's a band, or maybe it's a couple bands or a particular style. I find myself going through this kind of frequently. In fact, it's sort of like a regular flow of my listening where I'll really be into one particular thing for a couple weeks or maybe a month or so. For instance, like death metal, I'll go through these Florida death metal phases where I'm just listening to all this old school like Florida stuff. And then maybe I even get into, I'm on the Florida stuff for a week or two, and then I fall into Swedish death metal for another week or so. Or I might find myself listening to progressive stuff, really progressive rock, 70s progressive rock, or I love this sort of heavy hidden gem things that I talk about in my videos. I'll be going down these rabbit holes searching for bands, listening to all this kind of stuff. Maybe I'm even in just a classic rock phase where I'm listening to Boston and Led Zeppelin and Foghat and in bands like that. And it's interesting because when I'm in the middle of them, I'm so into it, I'm so engulfed in it, and then it's just like all of a sudden I wake up and I'm tired of it and I want to move on to something else. Sometimes I think, is it just my attention span, or what is it about me that I can't seem to stay in one place? But maybe it's a natural thing. You're into one particular thing for a little while, and then something else grabs your interest over here. You hear something else, or it reminds you of something. I will say that I do tend to go back to the stuff that I grew up on. That's sort of my home base, if you will. My original six that I always talk about: Maiden, Priest, Dio, Sabbath, Ozzy, AC/DC, that kind of classic 80s metal. And that's always my home base. I always kind of come back to that. It's my comfort food, if you will. I feel comfortable in that zone. But then I even get tired of that. And even within that, like I may really be in an Iron Maiden kick, but I'm in a new Iron Maiden kick, 2000s Rob era Iron Maiden kick, or maybe I'm listening to the Ripper era Priest stuff, or I'm only listening to Bon Scott's AC/DC, or I'm only listening to the last four or so AC/DC records. Like even when I'm into those particular bands, I tend to get into one area of their catalog. And sometimes I'll just land up going on a deep dive, like with people who have big catalogs, like Jethro Tull or Frank Zappa, where I'm just grabbing all this different stuff and just exploring and going deep into their catalogs. I was doing that with Yes not that long ago. I was just listening to all the different eras. And sometimes I'm only in the mood for sort of the 70s stuff, but I was exploring all these different eras and some things that I maybe hadn't listened to as much as I had some of the classic stuff from Yes. And also sometimes I go through these weird phases where I just don't feel like listening to anything. Or it feels like I can't find anything to listen to. Now that sounds crazy with all these records and with streaming and YouTube. There's just, everything is right there at your fingertips. Yet I do find myself sometimes, usually it doesn't last for very long, maybe just 3, 4, 5 days, where I just feel not interested in anything. Or I go off on a really far off tangent. Like right now, I'm listening to a lot of avant-garde classical stuff. Edgar Varese. I wasn't planning on talking about it, but I just had the record sitting right over there. And Edgar Varese is a 20th century, avant-garde classical composer that combines elements of electronics and stuff in some of his orchestral music and dissonance and stuff like that. It's pretty far out there. And right now I'm in this phase where I'm listening to all kinds of stuff like this. Varese, Karlheinz, Stockhausen, all other Boulez, all this other sort of out there classical stuff. But it's like I sort of feel not burnt out with the rock and the metal stuff. It's just I go through these phases where I just lose a little bit of interest in rock and metal, and I feel like maybe I gotta cleanse my palate and go to something completely different. You know, every now and then I'll go on a jazz fusion kick. I've got a Return to Forever record laying around on the floor here somewhere from not that long ago. They're a jazz fusion band from the 70s. So how about you guys? Do this too? Do you go through these phases where you're just listening to one genre or subgenre, or you're just really getting into one band? Or do you just get sort of tired altogether and not listen to any music? Sometimes I don't listen to any music at all. I find myself listening to a lot of podcasts when I'm in the car or I'm out for my walk, or I go off into classical music or fusion jazz or something like that. So let me know for you guys, has this ever happened to you? Do you find yourself, moving through these different phases? Is there any rhyme or reason or pattern to it? When I lived in Pennsylvania in the winter, I used to go through a black metal phase. It seemed like every January or February, I'd be really into black metal for a couple of weeks. And maybe it's because I live in Florida now. I never return to that. I really don't listen to black metal anymore. So maybe sometimes it's your environment, where you're at in your life, things that are going on in your life. Maybe there's type of music you listen to certain times of the year. So let me know in the comments down below if you're like me, if you go through musical phases, if there's times where you just can't find anything to listen to, you're just not excited about listening to anything. Let me know what you guys think and how it is for you down in the comments below. And until we see you again, make sure you rock hard, ride free.